The guitar was plugged in. That was the problem. July 25th, 1965. Newport Folk Festival, Rhode Island. Bob Dylan stood in the wings, watching the crowd settle into their seats. 17,000 people who thought they knew exactly who he was. 17,000 people who were about to be proven wrong. Dylan's hands were shaking. Not from fear, from anger that hadn't found its outlet yet. In his dressing room 20 minutes earlier, festival organizers had made their position clear. Keep it acoustic, keep it pure, keep it folk. That's what the people came for. That's what the movement needed. Dylan had nodded, said nothing, then walked straight to the stage manager and told him to wire the amplifiers. Now, standing backstage with an electric Fender Stratocaster strapped across his chest, Dylan could hear the murmur of anticipation from the crowd. They were expecting their poet, their voice of the generation, their acoustic prophet with a harmonica and a conscience. What they were about to get was something else entirely. But what happened after Dylan walked off that stage? What happened in the cement-walled backstage corridor when he came face to face with the man in black? That's the part nobody talks about. That's the part that mattered. The stage lights came up. Dylan walked out. The crowd erupted in applause. They saw the electric guitar. The applause continued, but confusion rippled through the audience. Some people laughed, thinking it was a joke. Some leaned forward, curious. Then the band kicked in. Loud, aggressive, electric. The folk festival had never heard anything like it. Dylan launched into Maggie's Farm. The amplifiers screamed. The drums pounded. This wasn't the gentle, acoustic Dylan they knew. This was raw. This was rock and roll invading their sacred space. It took 30 seconds for the booing to start. At first, scattered, then building, then overwhelming. "Judas!" someone screamed from the crowd. "Sell out!" "Where's the real Dylan?" Dylan kept playing. His face was stone. Every boo seemed to drive him harder, faster, angrier. The band behind him matched his energy. They weren't backing down. They were declaring war. 3 songs. That's all Dylan played. 3 songs that felt like 3 hours to everyone watching. 3 songs that split folk music into before and after. When the set ended, Dylan unplugged and walked off stage to a mixture of boos, confused applause, and stunned silence. The festival organizers were waiting for him in the wings. "What the hell was that?" Pete Seeger, the folk legend, looked like he'd witnessed a murder. "That wasn't music. That was noise. That was everything we've been fighting against." Dylan didn't respond. He walked past them, guitar still in hand, heading toward the backstage area. The narrow corridor behind the main stage was concrete and cold. Dressing rooms lined both sides. Various performers milled about, most of them staring at Dylan with expressions ranging from shock to disgust. A group of folk purists had gathered near the catering table. They saw Dylan approaching. "Sold out for the record companies," one of them said, loud enough to make sure Dylan heard. "Electric guitar, might as well be playing Vegas. The movement doesn't need rock and roll, it needs authenticity." Dylan stopped walking. His jaw tightened. But he didn't turn around. He just stood there, still holding the guitar, breathing hard. That's when Johnny Cash stepped out of his dressing room. Cash had been scheduled to perform later that evening. He'd been sitting in his room, door closed, listening to Dylan's electric set through the thin walls. He'd heard the booing, heard the anger. Now he stood in the doorway, dressed in his customary black, watching Dylan frozen in the corridor while the folk purists circled like sharks. Nobody noticed Cash at first. He had that quality. He could be in a room and people wouldn't see him until he wanted to be seen. Dylan turned around to face his critics. His voice was tight, controlled. "You wanted me to stay the same forever, like I'm some fucking museum piece. We wanted you to stay true to the cause," one of the purists shot back. Folk music means something. It stands for something. You just pissed on all of it for a record deal. I'm evolving, Dylan said. Artists evolve. Or do you want me to sing Blowin' in the Wind for the rest of my life? If that's what the movement needs, yes. Dylan's laugh was bitter. The movement. The movement doesn't own me. That's when Cash spoke. His voice was quiet, that distinctive rasp that could cut through any noise. They don't own you, but they think they do. Everyone turned. Cash stepped out of the doorway, moving slowly into the corridor. The folk purists immediately went quiet. Cash had that effect. His presence changed the temperature of a room. Dylan stared at Cash. They'd met briefly before, at industry events, but had never really talked. Cash was country. Dylan was folk. Different worlds, different audiences. Johnny, Dylan said, his voice still carrying that defensive edge. You here to tell me I sold out too? Cash stopped a few feet from Dylan. He pulled a pack of cigarettes from his jacket pocket, offered one to Dylan. Dylan took it. Cash lit both cigarettes with a silver Zippo, the flame briefly illuminating both their faces in the dim corridor. No, Cash said simply. I'm here because I know that look. What look? The look of a man in a cage he didn't build. The folk purists were still watching, but Cash's presence had shifted something. They weren't circling anymore. They were observers now. Dylan took a long drag of the cigarette. They wanted me to stay the same forever. I know. Your country, Dylan said, and there was an accusation in it. You're safe. Nobody expects you to change. You wear black. You sing about trains and prisoners, and everybody loves you for it. Cash was quiet for a moment. He looked at the cigarette in his hand, then back at Dylan. Bob, I wear black because nobody will let me forget where I came from. You think that's safe? You think that's comfortable? Dylan didn't answer. You know what people say about me? Cash continued, his voice still quiet, but carrying weight. They say I'm the voice of the forgotten, the prisoners, the poor, the broken. They made me a symbol. And you know what symbols are? What? Things that can't move, can't change, can't grow. They're frozen. Something in Dylan's expression shifted. The defensive anger was still there, but something else was creeping in. Recognition, maybe. I was in Folsom Prison last year, Cash said. Not as a prisoner, as a performer. Sang for the inmates. And you know what they told me afterward? They said it felt good to be seen, to be heard, to know someone gave a damn. Dylan listened, smoke curling around his face. But here's the thing nobody talks about, Cash continued. When I left that prison, I was still in one. Different bars, different walls, but a cage is a cage. What cage? Dylan asked, but his voice had softened. The cage of expectation, Cash said. The cage of image. The cage of being who people need you to be instead of who you are. The corridor had gone completely quiet. Even the folk purists had stopped murmuring. You played electric guitar tonight, Cash said. Everybody's calling you a traitor, a sellout. But you know what I saw? What? A man trying to break out of his cell. Dylan's hand shook slightly as he brought the cigarette to his lips. The difference between you and me? Cash said. You're angry that they won't let you change. I'm tired of them thinking they know who I am. Cash took a step closer. His voice dropped even lower, meant only for Dylan now. They booed you tonight, called you Judas, and it hurt. I can see it hurt. But here's what you need to understand. That hurt means you're still alive, still feeling, still fighting. The day you stop fighting is the day you become the museum piece they want you to be. Dylan's eyes were wet, but he wasn't crying. He was just finally, for the first time since walking off stage, feeling something other than rage. "I don't know if I can keep doing this," Dylan said quietly. "Yes, you can." "How do you know?" "Because men like us don't get to quit," Cash said. "We're too visible, too important to too many people, whether we want to be or not." Cash stubbed out his cigarette on the concrete wall. "Maybe we're both trapped, Bob. Just different prisons. I'm trapped in black. You're trapped in folk. But the bars are the same. Expectations, images, other people's needs." Dylan looked at Cash for a long moment. "So what do we do?" "We keep playing," Cash said. "We keep evolving. We keep breaking the bars they try to put around us. And when they boo, when they call us traitors, we remember that art isn't supposed to be comfortable, for them or for us." Somewhere down the corridor, a stage manager called for Cash. His set was in 20 minutes. Cash started walking toward his dressing room, then paused. He turned back to Dylan. "Bob, that electric set you just played? In 10 years, people will call it revolutionary. In 20 years, they'll call it historic. And in 30 years, they'll teach it in schools as the moment folk music grew up." "You really believe that?" Dylan asked. "I believe that real artists make people uncomfortable. And you just made 17,000 people very uncomfortable. That's not selling out. That's art." Cash disappeared into his dressing room. Dylan stood in the corridor for another moment, still holding his guitar, still processing. The folk purists who'd been circling earlier had dispersed. They had nothing more to say. Cash's presence had dissolved their certainty. Dylan walked to his own dressing room. He set the electric guitar carefully in its case. His hands had stopped shaking. That night, Johnny Cash performed his set. Acoustic, traditional, exactly what people expected. But those who knew him well, who really listened, heard something different in his voice. A weight, a weariness, a recognition of his own cage. Bob Dylan left Newport that night without speaking to anyone else. He drove back to New York in silence. But the anger that had been consuming him had transformed into something else. Not peace, exactly, but purpose. Years later, in a rare interview about that night, Dylan was asked if he regretted the electric set at Newport. "Regret?" Dylan said. "No. That night I met the only person who understood what I was trying to do." "Who?" the interviewer asked. "Johnny Cash. We talked for maybe 5 minutes, but he said something that stuck with me. He said we're both trapped in different prisons, and the only way out is to keep moving, keep changing, keep refusing to be what they want us to be." Did that conversation change how you approached your music? Dylan smiled, a rare sight. Every artist is in a cage. Some of us just choose to rattle the bars louder than others. Johnny Cash never spoke publicly about that night. That wasn't his way. But crew members who were there, stagehands who witnessed the conversation, they tell the story differently. They talk about how Dylan was ready to quit, how the booing had broken something in him, how the folk purists were tearing him apart in that corridor. And they talk about how Cash, the man in black, the quiet giant of country music, stepped out of his dressing room and said 7 words that changed everything. Maybe we're both trapped, Bob, just different prisons. 2 legends, 2 cages, 1 moment of understanding. The bars are still there, for every artist who dares to evolve, for every musician who refuses to be frozen in time, for every person who's ever been told, stay the same, when their soul is screaming, grow. Newport Folk Festival, 1965. The night Bob Dylan plugged in an electric guitar and became a traitor. The night Johnny Cash reminded him that real artists don't need permission to change. The night 2 men in different prisons recognized each other through the bars. Have you ever felt trapped by who people expect you to be? That's the cage. And the only way out is to do what Dylan did that night. Plug in, turn up, and let them boo. Because the ones who boo loudest are usually the ones most afraid of change.